When I saw the guest towel in the laundry, the one that wasn't supposed to be used, the one I folded and placed in the back of the closet weeks ago, my stomach twisted into a knot. It lay there, damp and heavy, like a secret pulled into daylight. At first, I thought it was just a mistake. Maybe someone used it by accident. But when I opened the washer and found his t-shirt, not just any, but the faded gray one he wore the night we stayed in talking too long, I felt the blood drain from my face. My hands trembled as I pulled the fabric out, still warm from the wash. That shirt didn't belong in this cycle. It wasn't supposed to be here. My husband wasn't supposed to come back today. He wasn't supposed to touch the laundry. And yet, I heard the sound of the garage door, then footsteps in the hallway. He was home. Too early. And I was standing in the laundry room, holding the one piece of evidence that could ruin everything. I shoved it under a pile of towels just as he appeared in the doorway, his gaze sharp, lingering. "Everything okay?" he asked. I nodded too quickly. My heart raced. He walked past me, toward the kitchen, not noticing the damp footprints near the door. Or maybe he did. Maybe he noticed everything. 3 months ago, I made a mistake, the kind you don't plan for, the kind that starts with a glance and ends with a silence you can't explain. Let me tell you what really happened. Before the full weight of this mistake collapses on everything I built, let me show you how I got here. There's a strange kind of quiet that fills a house once a child leaves it. It's not silence, not exactly. It's the absence of a voice, a laugh, the habitual creak of the stairs under his steps. When my son left for university, the air felt thinner. He took his clutter, his noise, and somehow all the color with him. I didn't cry, not that day. I stood at the doorway, waved as his car disappeared, then turned back into a hallway that felt too clean, too still. My husband offered a dry "he'll be fine" and returned to his phone. He didn't look at me. Not really. Not the way our son did when he asked me to take care of his friend who needed a place for a few weeks. He's quiet. He won't be a bother, my son promised. It's just while he waits for his dorm situation to be sorted out. I agreed, mostly because I didn't have a reason not to. But deep down, I think I wanted to feel useful. Wanted the echo of footsteps again. Even if they weren't my son's. When he arrived, tall, polite, backpack slung low and eyes that studied everything, I felt old. Not invisible, not yet. But older than I remembered being the day before. He thanked me, shook my hand instead of hugging like my son always did, and offered to carry the grocery bags in from the car. My husband was at work, as always. I wasn't surprised. We settled into a rhythm quickly. He was respectful, helpful. He cleaned up after himself, asked if he could help with dinner, told me my cooking reminded him of his grandmother's. I laughed, grateful for the compliment, even if it dated me. Days began folding into each other. My husband left earlier, came home later. At night, he sat with his laptop or phone, nodding through our conversations. Sometimes I'd say things twice just to be sure he heard. Sometimes I wouldn't say them at all. The guest, meanwhile, noticed everything. When I changed the living room flowers, he commented. When I wore a different pair of earrings, he noticed. It wasn't flirtatious, not in a way you could accuse. It was just attention. Real, deliberate attention. I hadn't felt that in years. One evening, after dinner, I found him in the kitchen drying dishes I hadn't asked him to touch. He smiled. "You're always doing everything. Let me help." It was such a simple thing. But I stood there, watching him fold the dishcloth just so, and something tightened in my chest. A kind of guilt, paired with a flutter. I shook it off. Told myself I was imagining it. The next day, I baked, something I hadn't done in months. My husband didn't notice the smell when he walked in. Didn't comment on the freshly cleaned floors. But the guest did. "You really made all this?" he asked, eyes wide. "I thought people only did that in movies." I laughed, but it was hollow. Because it reminded me how little effort I'd made for anyone in years. And how little anyone expected effort from me. I began waking up earlier, brushing my hair more carefully, choosing clothes I hadn't worn since before menopause became part of my vocabulary. I told myself it was for the routine. For structure. For discipline. But I noticed how his eyes followed me sometimes. And how mine found him in the room even when I tried not to look. One morning, I caught my husband looking at his phone with a strange expression. He didn't say anything, just locked the screen and slid it face down on the table. I asked if something was wrong. He said, "Just work. Always just work." Later that week, I went to the store with the guest. He helped me load the groceries. At a red light, he asked, "Are you happy?" I laughed. That's a big question for a Tuesday. But he waited. His silence pressed in. "I think so," I answered finally. "Why do you ask?" "You just don't seem like it sometimes." When we got home, I sat in the car a moment longer than I needed. My hand on the keys, my heart somewhere in my throat. That night, I dreamt of being younger. Of dancing in a room where someone looked at me like I mattered. I woke up before the alarm. The house was quiet again. But not the kind of quiet that means peace. The kind that means something is shifting. And it was. Something was shifting. Something in me. The next morning, the light filtering through the blinds felt different. Colder, sharper. I lay in bed listening to the distant sound of dishes clinking in the kitchen. He was up early again. He had started doing that, waking up before me, making coffee, quietly moving around the house like someone who belonged. Like someone who had always been here. And somehow, I didn't mind. I sat up slowly, pulling the robe tighter around me, suddenly aware of the looseness in my skin and the silence in my room. My husband had left earlier, leaving only a note about a meeting and a reminder to call the insurance company. Nothing personal. Nothing unusual. Just the sort of messages that had come to define our communication over the years. When I entered the kitchen, he looked up with that same easy smile, the one that made me forget how long it had been since anyone truly saw me. He pushed a cup of coffee across the counter without a word. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it hit harder than I expected. I sipped in silence, stealing glances at him over the rim of the mug. He was leaning against the sink, scrolling through his phone, barefoot, shirt slightly wrinkled, as if he'd just rolled out of bed and hadn't yet slipped into the armor of the outside world. He looked real. And next to him, I felt like a shadow, one of those background characters in my own home. That afternoon, I found myself standing in front of the mirror, holding two dresses against my body. I wasn't going anywhere. There was no occasion. But I kept asking myself which one made me look less tired. Less invisible. I chose the one I used to wear when we went to dinner parties, back when my husband would place his hand gently on the small of my back as we entered the room. That hadn't happened in years. I did my hair. Light makeup. Not too much. I told myself it was for me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Later, he asked if I wanted to take a walk, said the weather was too nice to waste indoors. I hesitated, thinking of the dishes in the sink, the laundry piling up. But he looked at me like none of it mattered. And I nodded. We walked in silence at first, down our quiet street where nothing ever seemed to change. He pointed out little things, a broken mailbox, a squirrel chasing its tail, small observations that made the world feel less dull. I realized how long it had been since someone shared the world with me that way. We reached the park. It was mostly empty, just the hum of distant traffic and birds overhead. We sat on a bench, side by side, not touching. I kept my hands folded in my lap, my shoulders stiff. But I could feel him there, just inches away, his presence loud in the quiet. He started talking about school, about pressure, about how strange it was to feel lost while pretending you had direction. I listened, nodding, feeling the ache of recognition. I told him I remembered that feeling, though it looked different now. How the world expects you to have it all figured out, career, marriage, family, and how failure to meet that image starts to feel like a personal flaw. He didn't interrupt. He listened the way people rarely do, without waiting for his turn to speak. And when I paused, he said, "You don't talk like someone who's invisible. But you look like you feel that way." It stunned me. Not because it was rude, but because it was true. We didn't say much on the way back. But the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was weighted with something neither of us wanted to name. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed with my husband beside me, snoring softly, the rise and fall of his chest steady and oblivious. I stared at the ceiling, thoughts unraveling like a thread I couldn't catch. I thought about what had changed. Not just in him, but in me. When did I start choosing silence over confrontation? When did I stop demanding to be seen? In the morning, I found him in the living room, reading. I sat across from him and said I was thinking of rearranging the furniture. He looked up, surprised, and said, "Why?" I shrugged. "It feels too still." He smiled. "Change is good." We moved the couch. The bookshelf. Even swapped the artwork between rooms. The house looked different afterward. Brighter. Airier. I told myself it was just the light. But I knew better. That evening, while preparing dinner, he stood close behind me, reaching past to grab a plate. Our arms brushed. It was barely a touch, a blink in time, but it ignited something. Not a fire, but a spark. A dangerous one. I stepped aside quickly, pretending to search for the salt. He didn't apologize. Just kept moving like nothing happened. And maybe it didn't, in his mind. We ate together, just the two of us. My husband had a dinner event, another excuse to be elsewhere. I barely tasted the food. My mind was elsewhere, racing, circling, unsure. When we finished, he cleared the table. I told him he didn't have to. He said, "I know," and kept going. I stood at the kitchen door, watching him rinse the plates, the way his shoulders moved, the quiet efficiency in his hands. I wasn't thinking clearly anymore. I was feeling. Afterward, we sat in the den, each with a book. The pages blurred before me. My heart beat too loudly. I could feel the weight of the moment building, the air thickening. When I finally looked up from the book, he was already looking at me. We kissed. It was brief. Soft. Unspoken. Then the silence roared back. I stood, too quickly. Said I was tired. That I needed to check on the laundry. Anything. I left the room without looking back. Upstairs, I stared at myself in the bathroom mirror for a long time. My lips looked the same. My face unchanged. But everything inside me had shifted. I pressed my fingers to my temples, trying to think. To plan. To rewind. But there was no undoing it. I didn't sleep that night either. The house creaked. The walls pressed in. And I realized this wasn't about one kiss. It was about everything that led to it. Everything I'd let fade. Everything I still wanted. Everything I'd tried to silence. The next morning came heavy, like the sky had dropped just a little lower overnight. I lay in bed, eyes open, staring at the seam in the ceiling, tracing it with my thoughts that didn't want to settle. I hadn't slept, not really. I had drifted in and out, my body tired but my mind relentless. When I finally got up, the house felt different. Not in the way it looked or sounded, but in how I moved through it, cautiously, as if each hallway might echo back the memory of something I couldn't explain. In the kitchen, he was already there, again. Of course. He sat at the table with a cup of coffee, scrolling through something on his phone. He looked up when I walked in, but this time, he didn't smile. Neither did I. I made my own coffee without a word. My hands were steady, but my heart wasn't. Every movement felt rehearsed, like I was performing the part of a woman who hadn't kissed someone who wasn't her husband less than 12 hours ago. He stood to leave the room, maybe sensing my unease, and I watched him go, a tightness forming in my chest. I wasn't sure what I wanted. For him to stay? For him to pretend nothing had happened? For me to rewind to the version of myself that wouldn't have let it happen in the first place? I spent the morning cleaning, not because it needed it, but because I did. I scrubbed counters, wiped cabinets, reorganized the pantry. My hands worked while my brain tried to make sense of the line I had crossed. But there was no clarity in the repetition, only fatigue. Around noon, I heard my husband's car pull into the driveway. I panicked for a moment, not because I had done anything openly wrong, but because guilt never needs proof. It just needs proximity. I straightened the towels, adjusted the fruit bowl, checked my reflection in the microwave door. Normal. Everything had to look normal. He walked in, briefcase in one hand, phone in the other. Back-to-back meetings, he muttered, barely glancing at me. He dropped his keys in the usual bowl, kissed the air near my cheek, and disappeared into his office without noticing the way my hand trembled around the dish towel. Later, as I prepared lunch, the guest appeared again, quiet, hesitant, like someone entering a room they weren't sure they were welcome in. He reached for a glass of water and didn't look at me. I didn't look at him. But the air between us was thick with the weight of what we weren't saying. I broke the silence first. I think it's best if we both forget about last night. His expression didn't change. He only nodded once, then said, I'm sorry. It was quiet. Simple. Final. We ate in separate spaces that day. The following morning, my husband announced that he'd be out of town for 2 nights. A last-minute work trip. I nodded, said I understood, and watched as he packed his things with the usual precision. I didn't ask where he was going. He didn't volunteer it. That evening, I sat alone in the living room, television on but muted, staring at a cooking show where everything was neat, measured, and always turned out right. I felt like I was observing someone else's life through a glass window. I could hear him, the guest, moving around upstairs, and every sound felt like a question I didn't want to answer. I stayed on the couch for hours, trying not to think, trying to keep my hands folded so tightly that they wouldn't reach for anything they shouldn't. At some point, he came downstairs to grab a snack, and we crossed paths in the hallway. Neither of us spoke. We just passed like strangers in a house that used to feel like mine. The next day was uneventful in the way that only emotionally charged days can be. Everything felt muted and loud at once. I went to the market, bought groceries I didn't need, wandered aisles with a list I never checked. I stayed out longer than necessary, returning only when the sky had started to darken. He was in the kitchen when I got back, unloading the dishwasher. He looked up as I entered, then turned back to the plates. I began putting away the food silently, moving around him without touching, without speaking. But at one point, we reached for the same cabinet door. Our hands brushed. I flinched. So did he. It was like touching a bruise neither of us had admitted was there. "I've been looking for a new place," he said suddenly, without turning to me. I paused, a bag of pasta still in my hands. "You don't have to do that." He looked at me then. "I think I do." I didn't argue. I didn't agree. I only nodded, slowly, and placed the pasta on the shelf like it mattered. That night, as I lay in bed, I wondered what my husband would say if he knew. Would he be angry? Hurt? Dismissive? Or would he simply shrug and go back to his emails? I didn't want to find out. The next morning, I woke early and went for a walk. The neighborhood was quiet, too early for gardeners, too late for night owls. I breathed in the cool air and tried to remind myself who I was before this. Before the glances, the silences, the unspoken things. I came back and found a note on the kitchen table in his handwriting. "Thanks for everything. I'll be out by the weekend." It was polite. Distant. Safe. And yet, it left me hollow. The rest of the day passed slowly. I avoided the parts of the house where he might be. I did laundry, vacuumed the guest room, folded towels that didn't need folding. It was all meaningless, but it filled the space between us with motion. That evening, my husband called. Said the trip was going well. That he might stay an extra day. That I shouldn't wait up. I said okay and hung up, staring at the phone like it might provide instructions on what to do next. The house was quiet again. Just the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of my own breathing. I poured a glass of water, then sat at the kitchen table and stared at nothing. Eventually, I went upstairs, closed my bedroom door, and leaned against it for a long time. My reflection in the mirror didn't look different, but I felt unrecognizable. The next morning would come, as it always did. But something was changing. Something fundamental. Not just in the house, but in me. And I wasn't sure if I wanted to stop it anymore. The morning arrived with a sharp breeze, the kind that sneaks through the smallest cracks in the windows and wraps around your ankles as a reminder that seasons change, whether you're ready or not. I stood by the window in my robe, watching the trees sway, the early light catching dust particles in the air. Everything felt slightly suspended, like the house was holding its breath along with me. Downstairs, the guest room door was closed. I paused outside it for a moment, unsure if he was asleep or avoiding me. Probably both. I moved on, letting the sound of the kettle boiling ground me back into routine. I needed routine now more than ever. The structure of ordinary things, boiling water, buttering toast, folding towels, these were the rituals that kept me from falling apart completely. He didn't come out for breakfast. I didn't go to check. I left a clean mug on the counter and a plate with 2 slices of toast, even though I knew he might not touch them. It wasn't about the food. It was about the gesture. About trying to hold on to something, anything, that resembled normal. Around mid-morning, I heard the front door close softly. I looked out the window and saw him walking down the sidewalk, backpack slung low, hands in his pockets. He didn't look back. I waited a few moments, then sat down at the kitchen table, letting the silence settle like dust around me. By afternoon, I'd managed to start on a list of things that needed doing. The garage needed reorganizing. The front yard was overgrown. The hallway closet had become a collection site for forgotten things. I moved through the house like someone staging it for strangers, folding, wiping, putting away, but the truth was, I was trying to regain control of a space that no longer felt entirely mine. It was sometime around 4 when the doorbell rang. I wiped my hands on my jeans and opened the door to find our neighbor, holding a small bag of apples from her tree and a too-curious smile. She asked how I'd been, said she hadn't seen me much lately, and then, with a glance over my shoulder, asked if the young man was still staying with us. There was nothing accusatory in her voice. Just that familiar neighborly nosiness, coated in artificial sweetness. I smiled, told her he'd be leaving soon, and thanked her for the apples. But something in the way she lingered on the porch made my heart beat faster. She knew something. Or thought she did. And I wasn't sure which was worse. After she left, I stared at the apples in the bowl on the counter, their skins too shiny, too perfect. I had the sudden urge to throw them away, to get rid of anything that reminded me of the cracks forming beneath the surface. That evening, I heard the front door again. He had come back. I didn't ask where he'd gone. He didn't offer. We moved around each other in the kitchen like ghosts of ourselves, silent and careful. At one point, as I reached for a bowl on the top shelf, he stepped forward to help, his hand brushing mine. I froze. He did too. The contact was brief, but it echoed through the room like a dropped glass. We both stepped back. Neither of us said a word. After dinner, which we ate separately, I found myself drawn to the back porch. The air had cooled, the sky streaked with fading pink and gray. I sat on the old wooden bench, pulling a blanket around my shoulders, and tried to quiet the noise in my head. That's when he stepped outside, carrying 2 mugs of tea. He handed one to me without speaking, then sat on the edge of the porch, facing the yard. We sat like that for a long time, not speaking. Just breathing. Eventually, he said, "I'm sorry. Not just for the kiss. For all of it. For making things confusing." I didn't respond right away. I looked out at the garden, at the small solar lights blinking on, one by one. "It wasn't just you," I said finally. He nodded, but didn't look at me. "I'm leaving tomorrow." My throat tightened, but I kept my expression still. "That's probably best." "I didn't want to," he added quietly. "I didn't want this," I whispered, more to myself than to him. We sat a while longer until the tea went cold. That night, I crawled into bed before my husband returned from his trip. I didn't wait up. I didn't need to. The next morning was different. Brighter, somehow, even though I felt heavier. I got up early and went through the motions: shower, laundry, breakfast. He was already packing when I passed his room. The sight of his open suitcase, the neatly folded clothes, the empty corners of the space he had occupied for weeks, it all hit me harder than I expected. Before he left, he stopped at the front door and turned back. For a second, I thought he might say something important. Something final. But he just said, "Take care of yourself." I nodded. "You too." And then he was gone. The door clicked shut. The house exhaled. For the rest of the day, I moved slowly. The silence was no longer weighted with potential, just absence. I tried to distract myself with chores again, but they felt hollow now. The kitchen gleamed. The floors were spotless. And still, everything felt out of place. That evening, I sat across from my husband at the dinner table. He told me about his meetings, the people he'd seen, the delays in travel. I nodded, responded where appropriate, asked follow-up questions. We were a well-rehearsed routine, our lines memorized, our scenes repeated. He didn't ask how things had been at home. I didn't volunteer anything. After dinner, he went to his office. I cleared the table, washed the dishes, and stood at the sink far longer than necessary, watching the last bit of sunlight disappear beyond the trees. Later that night, lying in bed beside him, I stared at the ceiling again. Same seam. Same quiet. But something in me had shifted, not just from guilt or fear, but from the realization that I had stopped belonging to the version of my life I had been clinging to. And once you see that clearly, it's impossible to look away. Tomorrow would come. And I still didn't know who I was in this story. only that I wasn't the same woman who started it. The morning after he left, I woke earlier than usual, as if my body hadn't yet accepted his absence. The house was still, and for the first time in weeks, there was no sound of footsteps coming from the guest room, no low hum of conversation or movement in the kitchen. Only silence. Cold, dense silence. I moved through my routine mechanically, coffee, toast, wiping down the counters that didn't need wiping. The air in the house felt hollow, like a stage after the final curtain call. I kept expecting to see him appear around the corner, offering to help, asking if I needed anything, giving me that quiet look of attention that had become dangerously comforting. My husband had left early again, leaving a note by the coffee maker reminding me to reschedule the car service. It was written in his usual all-caps print, impersonal and efficient. I folded the note without reading the rest and slid it into the drawer beside the scissors. Later that day, while organizing a shelf in the laundry room, I found a small plastic bag with receipts tucked between the detergent and the spare light bulbs. I didn't remember putting it there. Inside were old purchase slips, groceries, hardware, a coffee shop I hadn't visited. And tucked in between them, almost hidden, was a piece of notebook paper folded into a neat square. I hesitated before opening it, as if I already knew what it was. And I did. It was a note from him. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was short, written without hesitation. Asterisk, if you ever feel like you're still disappearing, don't. I saw you. Every day. Asterisk. I read it 3 times before folding it again and placing it back where I found it. I didn't tear it. I didn't throw it away. I just left it there, hidden among the ordinary things. The rest of the afternoon passed slowly. I did laundry, vacuumed the stairs, emptied the dishwasher. Mundane tasks, each one meant to fill the space he'd left behind. But nothing filled it. I felt as though I was floating through my own house like a visitor. Around 5, I got a message from my son. He'd landed a part-time job at the university library and sounded excited about it. He sent a photo of his new desk and a blurry shot of a sandwich he was proud of making himself. I replied with heart emojis and a short message telling him I was proud of him too. He didn't ask about the house. He didn't ask about anything, really. And maybe that was a gift. By the time evening came, I had grown restless. I didn't want to cook. I didn't want to watch television. So I stepped out onto the porch with a glass of water and sat on the bench where we'd once shared tea. The cushion was still slightly indented where he used to sit. I traced the rim of the glass with my finger and listened to the hum of crickets rising from the grass. The sky was bruised purple and fading fast. A car passed on the street, headlights slicing across the lawn, then disappearing again. It was then that I saw a figure approaching. For a brief second, my heart stopped, irrationally, foolishly hoping it was him. But it was just my husband, coming up the walkway with his coat slung over one shoulder and his expression unreadable. He greeted me casually, asked if I'd eaten, and I lied, saying yes. He didn't press. We both sat on the porch, not touching, not even facing the same direction. He began talking about his day, a new project, an issue with someone in finance, traffic. I nodded, made the appropriate responses, but my mind was far away. I noticed the way his voice didn't rise or fall with emotion, how every sentence ended with a sense of finality. Like he was reciting from a script. Eventually, I stood and told him I was tired. He said he'd come in soon. Inside, I lingered in the hallway for a moment, hand resting on the banister, listening to the quiet between his words. It struck me then that we had perfected the art of coexisting. We had routines, expectations, even kindness. But intimacy? That had long ago eroded into polite silence. The next morning, while changing the sheets in the guest room, I found something beneath the pillow, a paperback book, dog-eared and slightly worn. It was one he'd been reading during his stay. I held it for a while, unsure of what to do with it. Then I placed it back on the shelf where the others were kept. I didn't want to throw it away. I couldn't pretend it hadn't been there. Later that day, I ran into the neighbor again while bringing in the mail. She asked how I was, mentioned the weather, then, as if in passing, commented that the young man who had been staying seemed very charming. I smiled thinly, said he was polite, and changed the subject. But the words stuck with me. Not because of what she said, but because of how quickly I had to lie, even to someone who hadn't asked the real question. That night, after dinner, my husband brought out a bottle of wine, something we hadn't done in a while. He poured 2 glasses, handed me one, and we sat in the living room with a show playing in the background. We sipped in silence. I wondered if he felt it too, the shift in the air, the distance between us that had grown larger than the room we were in. Eventually, he asked how I'd been feeling lately. It was an unusual question. I told him I was fine. That I'd been busy with the usual things. He nodded, then looked down at his glass. "You've seemed a little different." I paused, carefully measuring my next words. "Maybe I am." He didn't press further. Just nodded again and returned his gaze to the television. That night, lying beside him, I thought about how simple it was to live a life wrapped in quiet agreements. No accusations, no confrontations, just mutual silence, like a contract neither of us remembered signing. And yet, underneath that silence, something had shifted. Not just because of what had happened, but because of what it revealed. That I had spent too many years erasing myself in small ways. That attention had become so rare, I mistook it for affection. That being seen could feel like love, even when it wasn't. But now, I couldn't unsee myself. I couldn't pretend nothing had changed. And I knew, even if nothing ever came of it, even if life returned to its predictable rhythm, something inside me would never settle again. The days that followed blurred together in their predictability. Morning coffee. Silence over breakfast. Lists of things to do that I created more to distract myself than out of necessity. The house was tidy. Meals were made. Everything on the surface looked intact. But I felt like I was walking through a life I had outgrown, quietly, deliberately, trying not to make noise in a house built on routine. My husband had started lingering longer in his office at night. I noticed, though I never asked why. Maybe he needed space too. Maybe he could feel the quiet unraveling between us and didn't know how to stop it. Or maybe he didn't care to. One afternoon, I found myself in the attic. I didn't plan to go there. I was searching for a missing box of holiday decorations, and I climbed the narrow stairs almost absent-mindedly. Dust coated the floor in thin layers, and the light from the small window cast sharp angles across forgotten objects. I moved slowly, my hands brushing across old books, and used luggage, a box of my son's childhood toys I hadn't opened in years. Then I saw it, a smaller box pushed far into the corner, labeled in my handwriting. Inside were old photos. Some from before we were married, others from our first apartment, a few from a trip we took to the coast during our first year together. I stared at one in particular, a photo of us laughing, hair messy from the wind, his arm draped around my shoulder in a way that once felt second nature. I sat on the attic floor and let the memory wash over me. We had been happy once. Not perfect, but connected. Back then, it felt like there was always something to talk about, something to discover in each other. But somewhere along the way, the conversations had shrunk into exchanges of logistics, and our connection had narrowed into shared calendars and overlapping routines. I returned downstairs with the photo, tucked it into the drawer of my nightstand without really knowing why. Maybe I needed proof that once, things were different. That evening, as I prepared dinner, my husband stood by the counter reading something on his phone. Without looking up, he asked if I'd talked to our son lately. I said I had. He nodded. Then, after a pause, asked, "Is he doing okay?" "Yes," I said, placing chopped onions into the pan. "He's working part-time." "Sounds happy." "Good," he said. Then nothing more. Later that night, I took a walk alone. I hadn't planned to, but I needed air. The house felt heavy, and I didn't want to sit through another hour of television that neither of us was really watching. The neighborhood was quiet, most homes lit warmly from the inside, silhouettes moving behind curtains, the soft glow of televisions flickering. I passed the park where I had once walked with him, the guest, the young man I had let too far into the hollow space inside me. The bench we'd sat on was empty now. Just another object in a world that had gone on without acknowledging what had happened. As I stood there, I thought about choices. Not just the ones we make in moments of weakness, but the ones we make every day, to stay, to remain silent, to turn away from the version of ourselves that wants more. I wasn't proud of what had happened. But I was even less proud of how long I had allowed myself to disappear in my own life. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table with a pad of paper, intending to write a grocery list. But instead, I wrote a letter. Not one I would send. Not one I even wanted to keep. But I needed to get the words out. I needed to name what I had been afraid to say out loud. I wrote about how lonely I had been. How unseen. How his presence had felt like a mirror, reflecting back the parts of me I thought had been buried under years of being fine. I didn't justify anything. I didn't beg for forgiveness. I simply told the truth, to myself. When I finished, I folded the paper in half and placed it in the drawer with the old photo. I wasn't ready to throw it away, but I wasn't ready to read it again either. Later that day, my husband mentioned he would be home late, a work dinner. He said it in the same tone he used for weather reports and oil changes. I nodded. Told him to drive safe. Then watched the door close behind him. And I realized I had no idea where he actually went in the evenings. The thought should have hurt. But it didn't. Not really. It just felt like another piece of the quiet agreement we both lived under: don't ask, don't push, don't change. That night, I found myself in the guest room, sitting on the bed he had once used. The sheets had long been washed, the air fresh, nothing left to suggest he had ever been there. But still, the room held something, an imprint, a pause in time. I sat there until the house grew dark, until the only sound was the refrigerator humming downstairs and the soft tick of the hallway clock. When I finally returned to our bedroom, my husband was already asleep. His side of the bed rose and fell with even breaths. I lay beside him and stared at the ceiling. I tried to imagine what he would do if he ever knew the truth. If he found that letter. If I told him, directly and without excuse, what had happened and why. But more than that, I wondered whether it would even matter. Because maybe the worst part of it all wasn't the betrayal. Maybe it was that the person I betrayed had stopped seeing me long before I ever crossed a line. And I had let him. Morning would come again. Like it always did. And I would rise, brush my teeth, make the coffee, and keep moving through the house we built together, brick by brick, silence by silence. The morning unfolded like so many others, quiet, still, predictable. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror brushing my hair, my reflection pale in the soft light. The woman staring back at me looked calm, put together. No one would have guessed the chaos that had once stirred inside her, or the weight she now carried just beneath the surface. Downstairs, I moved through the kitchen in near silence, the ceramic clink of a mug against the countertop, the rhythmic gurgle of the coffee maker the only sounds. The routine soothed me. Not because I enjoyed it, but because it didn't ask questions. Routines never demand explanations. They just let you move forward one task at a time. My husband had left early for work again. He hadn't said much during breakfast, just the usual notes about traffic and a reminder that the insurance renewal paperwork was on the hallway table. I nodded, answered where needed, and waited until he walked out the door. When the house was finally mine again, I sat at the dining table and looked through the open window. The breeze moved the curtains in a gentle, hypnotic motion. I focused on that motion, trying to steady my mind, but it kept drifting, to the space between what I had done and what I now had to live with. I didn't want to regret it. That's what I told myself. But regret didn't always look like shame. Sometimes it looked like remembering how it felt to be noticed again. And sometimes it looked like a quiet house where nothing had changed, except me. That afternoon, I went to the grocery store, wandering through the aisles longer than necessary. I lingered by the produce, inspecting apples and avocados I didn't intend to buy. I read the labels on sauces I'd never used. No one rushed me. No one noticed me. And yet, I found myself glancing over my shoulder more than once, as if expecting to see him there again. As if the air might shift and signal something familiar. Back home, I unpacked everything methodically. Canned goods in the pantry, vegetables in the drawers, eggs on the middle shelf. I moved through it with mechanical precision. It wasn't about groceries, it was about feeling like I was still in control of something. Later, while folding laundry in the bedroom, I heard the sound of the front door. My husband had returned earlier than usual. I paused with a towel in my hands, listening. His footsteps moved through the hallway and into the kitchen, then stopped. A few moments later, he appeared in the doorway. "I forgot my charger this morning," he said. "Thought I'd grab it before the next meeting." I nodded. "It's probably in the office." He disappeared down the hall, and I stood perfectly still. It should have been a normal moment. It was. But the way my shoulders tensed, the way my breath held, everything in me was waiting. For something. For nothing. I didn't know anymore. When he left again, I sat on the edge of the bed, towel still in my lap. The silence felt heavier than usual. As if the house itself had begun to suspect something I hadn't confessed. That evening, I took a walk. Just a few blocks this time. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the pavement. I passed the same houses, the same trees, the same yards. Nothing had changed. Everything had changed. When I returned, the house was dim. I moved toward the kitchen to turn on a light, but paused when I saw something on the table. A set of keys. Not mine. Not my husband's. I stared at them for a long moment, then reached out, heart pounding. Attached to the ring was a tag, the name of a real estate agency I recognized, and an address scribbled on the back of an old receipt. At first, I didn't understand. Then, I remembered. He had mentioned finding a place. Quietly, like an afterthought. I hadn't known he was serious. I hadn't known he would leave something behind for me. The realization hit me like a wave, not because of the keys, but because of what they meant. A choice. An invitation. Or maybe a goodbye. I didn't know which. I stood at the table, keys in hand, for what felt like hours. I imagined driving to that address. I imagined the room. The way he might look at me if I knocked on the door. The questions I might not be able to answer. I placed the keys back on the table. That night, I couldn't sleep. My husband lay beside me, breathing evenly, his back to me. I stared at the ceiling, thinking about the keys. About the receipt. About how silence sometimes leaves more bruises than words ever could. Around midnight, I got out of bed and walked downstairs. I didn't turn on any lights. The house was a familiar map in the dark. I sat at the kitchen table, the keys still there, unmoved. I ran my finger along the edge of the tag, over the faded ink of the address. I didn't want to leave. That was the truth. But I didn't want to stay in this version of my life either. Somewhere, between who I had been and who I was becoming, I had lost the ability to pretend everything was fine. I couldn't unknow what it felt like to be looked at and seen. I couldn't unfeel the sense of waking up after years of sleepwalking. Eventually, I tucked the keys into a drawer. Not to throw away. Not yet. But not to carry either. I returned upstairs, slipped back under the covers, and stared into the dark until the first light of morning crept in through the window. We had built a quiet life. A neat, well-kept one. But I was no longer sure I could live inside the quiet without losing myself again. And somewhere out there was a door I hadn't decided whether to open. The following morning, I woke with the unsettling awareness that I'd slept too soundly. The sun had already crept past its usual place on the windowsill, and the room was filled with a brightness I wasn't prepared for. My husband was gone. His side of the bed was cold, the pillow barely indented. I sat up slowly, disoriented by how easily the night had passed, despite the storm of questions I'd carried to bed. Downstairs, everything was in its usual place. The coffee was still warm in the pot, a folded note beside it, his handwriting neat and brief. Asterisk meeting downtown. Back late. Leftover stew in the fridge. Asterisk. I stared at the note for a long moment before folding it and placing it in the drawer with the others. The collection was growing. They weren't love letters or reminders of sweet gestures. They were artifacts of a life that had become purely functional. Useful. Predictable. Loveless, not in cruelty, but in the absence of need. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stepped out onto the back porch. The early spring air was cool, tinged with the scent of damp earth. The garden still needed weeding. I made a mental note but didn't move. I sat on the bench where I'd shared tea with someone I should have never let in, and I waited. Waited for what, I didn't know. A thought. A sign. A feeling that might lead me toward a decision. But instead, the world remained still. At some point, I went back inside and opened the drawer where I'd left the keys. They were there, untouched, quiet in their weight. The tag was still bent in one corner. The address stared up at me, almost daring me to act. I picked them up, held them in my palm. They didn't feel like escape. They felt like a challenge I hadn't yet accepted or declined. By late afternoon, I found myself pacing. I started a load of laundry. I made the bed again. I reorganized the spice drawer. I vacuumed under the couch, discovering a lost button and 2 pennies. None of it calmed me. None of it brought clarity. It was around 6 when the front door opened. My husband's footsteps were slower than usual, his bag dropping to the floor with a thud that felt heavier than its contents. I turned the stove off where I'd been simmering rice and met him in the hallway. He looked tired. His shirt was wrinkled. His tie loosened. He glanced at me briefly, then down the hall. "We need to talk," he said. The words hung in the air. I nodded. We sat in the living room, not across from each other, but angled, like we couldn't face directly into whatever was coming. I waited. He took a breath. "I found something," he said, his voice quiet but steady. The air shifted. My skin went cold. I wanted to ask what, but I didn't need to. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a key. Not the ones from the drawer. A different one. My heart dropped. "I was in the garage this morning," he continued. The old tool chest, you must have left it there. My throat closed. I remembered then. I had moved them weeks ago, afraid they'd be seen, and I must have forgotten one. Careless. Stupid. I didn't know what it was at first, he said. But then I saw the address on the tag. I stared at the floor. I went there, he added, almost like an afterthought. My breath caught. You what? I needed to see it, he said. To know if I was crazy. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse me. That somehow made it worse. Was it just once, he asked. I looked up, and in that moment, I saw everything I had destroyed without meaning to. The disbelief. The quiet devastation. Not because he'd caught me. But because he had been hoping he was wrong. I couldn't answer. Not because I wanted to lie, but because the truth would do nothing but reopen a wound that had already started to bleed. He nodded slowly, as if my silence confirmed everything. I don't want details, he said. But I needed to say it out loud. I needed to stop pretending I didn't notice. Tears pricked my eyes, but I held them back. He deserved honesty, not guilt. I never planned for it to happen, I whispered. He gave a small, humorless laugh. That's the thing about most mistakes. We rarely schedule them. The room felt too quiet after that. Like the house itself had paused to listen. I don't know what this means for us, he said finally. I don't even know what I want right now. I understand, I said, my voice barely audible. He stood up, ran a hand through his hair, then looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. I'm going to stay with my brother for a few days, he said. Just to think. I nodded. He didn't touch me. Didn't look back as he walked to the door and left. When the door clicked shut, I sat frozen. The sun had nearly set. The house was dim. I didn't turn on the lights. I sat in the silence, letting it settle around me like a second skin. Hours passed. I didn't move. Eventually, I rose and returned to the drawer where the other keys still waited. I held them again, the metal cold in my palm. Now both sets were accounted for. 2 doors. 2 paths. 2 versions of the truth. But all I knew in that moment was that the version I had built so carefully was now gone. And whatever came next would not begin with a key. The morning after he left, the house felt hollow in a new way. Not quiet like before, but emptied. As if something essential had been removed from the walls, the air, the floors. I walked barefoot from room to room, aimless, touching objects I had passed 1,000 times without noticing. The edge of the hallway mirror. The corner of the worn bookshelf. The frame of the door to the guest room that was no longer his. Nothing had changed. Everything had changed. I didn't make coffee. I didn't eat. I sat at the kitchen table in my robe long after the light had shifted from soft to sharp, the morning slipping away without my participation. Outside, birds moved through the yard, indifferent. A neighbor's car door slammed. Somewhere, a dog barked. Life continued, oblivious to the fracture inside my home. Eventually, I stood and washed my face. The water was cold. It startled me into motion. The rest of the day passed in slow motion. I did small, necessary things. Refilled the bird feeder. Watered the plants. Folded towels that didn't need folding. I moved through each task with the mechanical precision of someone who had no other option but to keep going. Not because I was strong, but because stopping meant thinking. In the afternoon, my son called. His voice was bright, full of energy. He told me about a new class he was taking, a girl he might ask out, a professor he didn't like. I listened, nodded, offered the right responses. I didn't mention his father. I didn't mention anything. Some truths don't belong in short phone calls. After we hung up, I sat with the silence that followed. It was the kind of silence that carries weight, not peaceful, not empty, but dense with what's unspoken. Later that evening, I opened the drawer again and looked at the keys. Both sets. His and mine. The real ones, the symbolic ones. I didn't know why I hadn't thrown them away. Maybe part of me still needed them. Not to use, but to remember. I sat on the couch, wrapped in a blanket I didn't need, and watched the shadows crawl across the walls as the sun dipped lower. The television remained off. The phone untouched. I didn't want sound. I didn't want distraction. I wanted stillness, even if it hurt. I thought about the conversation the night before. His voice. The look in his eyes when he said he'd known. That he'd gone to the apartment. That he had stood in the place where something happened that I couldn't take back. I thought about the way he didn't yell. The way he didn't accuse. The way his pain lived just under the surface, controlled but undeniable. Somehow, that hurt more than anything else. The quiet resignation. The distance that came not from anger, but from heartbreak. That night, I didn't sleep. I moved from room to room, eventually settling in the guest room. I curled under the blanket and stared at the ceiling. I thought about the moments that led me here, not the obvious ones, but the quiet ones. The thousands of days when I stopped asking for more. When I stopped being seen, even by myself. At some point, maybe around 3 in the morning, I heard a noise downstairs. I froze, listening. Just the wind, I thought. But then a light flicked on. My heart jumped. I sat up, held my breath. Footsteps. Then his voice. My husband's. I stepped into the hallway and saw his silhouette at the bottom of the stairs. He looked up, surprised but not startled. I left my work phone here, he said, holding up a black device. I thought you'd be asleep. I stayed at the top of the stairs. I couldn't sleep. He nodded, then looked down at the phone. I wasn't sure if I should knock. The absurdity of it struck me. A man knocking on the door of his own house. You still live here, I said quietly. He didn't move. Do I? I didn't answer. The question didn't feel like one I could respond to. Not yet. He stayed there for a moment longer, then turned toward the door. I'll come by later this week. We should talk. Yes, I said. We should. He opened the door, stepped out, and closed it gently behind him. I stood in the hallway long after he was gone. Then returned to the guest room, laid back down, and watched the ceiling fade as dawn began to approach. In the morning, I walked into the garden. The soil was damp from early dew. I knelt and began pulling weeds, not caring that the ground soaked through the knees of my pants. My hands moved quickly, efficiently. Dirt under my nails. Sun on my back. Something real. Something simple. At some point, I found myself crying, not sobbing, not dramatic tears, but a slow, steady stream that surprised me more than it relieved me. I let it happen. I didn't wipe my face. I didn't try to explain it. By the time I stood, the sun was higher, and I was covered in earth. My arms ached. My back hurt. But for the first time in a long time, I felt something shift. Not clarity. Not peace. But maybe the beginning of acceptance. That evening, I opened the drawer one last time. I held both sets of keys in my hands. Then I placed them in a small envelope and wrote a note. Asterisk, these belong to a version of me I can't return to. Asterisk. I sealed the envelope and tucked it in the back of my closet, not to hide, but to put away, like closing a chapter. The doorbell never rang that day. No unexpected visitors. No calls. Just me. In my house. In my silence. And for the first time, I wasn't trying to fill it. I was learning how to live inside it. The final days of that week passed like thin pages turning in a book I wasn't ready to finish. Each one was slightly different from the last, but none of them brought resolution. I moved through my routines quietly, deliberately, allowing the shape of the house, the shape of the days, to settle around me again. It wasn't comfort exactly, but it was something close. On Friday morning, I received a message from my son. He was planning a surprise visit home for the weekend, just for 2 days. I stared at the screen for a long time after reading it. A part of me was glad. Another part was afraid. There was so much beneath the surface of this house now, and I wasn't sure what would rise to meet him when he walked through the door. I spent the day preparing, not because I had to, but because I needed something to do with my hands. I changed the sheets in his room. I baked the lemon bread he always asked for. I restocked the fridge with the things he liked. It felt oddly like preparing for a guest and a homecoming at the same time. Late that afternoon, he arrived. The moment I opened the door and saw him standing there, taller somehow, a little leaner, I felt a strange ache in my chest. Not sadness. Not joy. Just something sharp and familiar, the awareness of time. He hugged me, tightly, without questions. I held on longer than I meant to. We spent the evening talking about his classes, his job, the girl he liked but hadn't yet asked out. I listened, smiled, nodded, filling the space between us with all the right gestures. He didn't notice the new tension in the house. Or if he did, he was too polite to mention it. At dinner, he asked where his father was. I paused for a moment, then answered honestly. He's staying with his brother for a few days. He looked up. Is everything okay? I took a breath. We're figuring things out. He didn't press, just nodded and looked down at his plate. I appreciated that more than he would ever know. Later that night, after he went to bed, I walked through the house turning off lights. When I reached the guest room, I paused at the doorway. The bed was perfectly made. The air undisturbed. I closed the door gently and moved on. I sat in the living room for a while, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the cold fireplace. I thought about everything that had happened, not just the affair, not just the confession, but the slow erosion that had come before it. The silence I had accepted for so long. The parts of myself I had given up without realizing. It would be easy to blame what happened on one moment. One mistake. But the truth was more complicated. It always is. I thought about my husband. I didn't know where he was that night, or what he was thinking. I didn't know if he'd ever come back, not physically, but emotionally. And I wasn't sure I would ask him to. The next morning, my son made coffee and offered to run errands with me. We drove through town, stopping for groceries and a quick lunch. He told stories from school, played music I didn't recognize, and laughed easily. For those few hours, I let myself believe everything was still normal. That we were just mother and son on a quiet Saturday. That nothing beneath the surface had changed. But as we were driving home, he asked something that caught me off guard. Were you happy? Before all this? I glanced at him. He was staring out the window, not looking at me. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. I don't know, I answered honestly. I used to think I was. Or that being fine was enough. He nodded slowly but didn't say anything else. That evening, after he left, the house returned to silence. I cleaned up the dishes, folded the blanket on the couch, put away the last of the groceries. I found myself standing in the middle of the living room, unsure of what to do next. Then, without quite knowing why, I opened the closet and pulled out the envelope. The one with the keys. The one I hadn't touched since placing it there days before. I took it to the table and opened it slowly. The keys lay inside, as quiet and solid as I remembered. I looked at them, turning them in my palm, thinking not about doors or places, but choices. What had they really represented? Not escape. Not even betrayal. They were proof that someone had seen me. That I had once allowed myself to be seen. I placed the keys back in the envelope and sealed it again. This time, I didn't return it to the closet. I walked to the fireplace and laid it gently in the empty hearth. I didn't burn it. Not yet. But I knew I would. Eventually. Later that night, just as I was turning off the lights, I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. My heart stuttered. I moved to the window and looked out. It was him. My husband. He sat in the car for a long moment before stepping out. No bag. No suitcase. Just him, hands in his coat pockets, walking slowly toward the door. I didn't move. I didn't open it. I waited. When the knock came, it was soft. I opened the door. We stood there, looking at each other. No anger. No accusation. Just the silence of people who had both been hurt in different ways. I didn't know where else to go, he said. You live here, I replied. He nodded. I stepped aside, and he entered. He didn't ask where I'd been, and I didn't ask what he'd decided. We didn't talk about the past. Not that night. We sat in the kitchen with 2 cups of tea between us, hands wrapped around ceramic for warmth, the space between us both familiar and foreign. We didn't make promises. We didn't pretend forgiveness was already earned. We just sat. And in the stillness, I understood something for the first time: healing doesn't begin with answers. It begins with presence. And we were both there. At last.